world filled with distractions, anxieties, and temptation, can we find a better way? How can we be transformed? In a world where we have little choice but to play them, how do we find a winning strategy for these mind games?
You ever been around somebody that you just knew was somebody? Right? Somebody that walks in a room and they just kind of ooze charisma. Right? They have a smile that goes on for days, and just the way they carry themselves has this rock star kind of air that just kind of sucks the air out of the room and makes it clear to you that you know that they know they're the biggest personality in the room. In fact, you know that they know they're probably the biggest personality in most rooms they walk into. We see it all the time in pop culture. We see it in politics. We see it in the world around us. And we would probably be amiss if we didn't admit there's something like that in the church world. There's a church version of that. There's a ministry version of that. And early on in my ministry, I had met some people who had that kind of gravitas. They just drew people to them with the force of their personality. And of course, as you have opportunity to go to conferences and hear people speak, you see some of those big personalities. Now, let me make clear, I'm not disparaging that or in any way trying to say that it is itself inherently a flaw. It's the way that God has wired some folks, right? Like it's the way that some people are created with just this kind of air about them. And most of the time in ministry circles, at least when I was starting out in pastoral ministries, you'd hear the stories of people's success and their meteoric growth of the ministries they were leading. And it was easy to start to kind of idolize people. Like, man, if we could just figure out how to do what they do, right? That's why they're on the stage at the conference. So you could take it home, and for $19.99, you could try to do it yourself. So I remember fairly early in ministry, our district was putting on a training day for pastors. And they were bringing in a speaker for the day. And it was someone I had heard lots of stories about. Right? I had heard the way in which God had worked through and moved in their ministry over the years. People that I knew, people that I respected, people that I looked up to, knew and respected and looked up to this guy. And so I was jazzed. I was excited, like, all right, this is going to be awesome. So I went to the learning day and I settled in. I'll never forget, he stepped up to the platform and began to speak. And my very first thought was, really? This guy? Right? All the stories I'd heard had set me up to expect this rock star persona who would just suck the air out of the room, would just draw everyone's awe to him by the way he carried himself. In reality, the guy I saw take the platform seemed much more regular than that. Pretty low-key. Nothing jumped off the page. And I thought, how is this the guy that's at the center of all the stories I've heard about? He wasn't a superhero. He was just an everyday, relatable guy. And all it took was a few minutes of listening to him to understand he wasn't at the center of the stories that I had heard. Jesus was. He just had been following Jesus closely enough to be right there with him in the thick of it all. As I listened that day and had to reconstruct what I thought about ministry and success, it became clear that this guy oozed Jesus the way that some people oozed charisma, and it started to make sense. So if we want to have success, if we want to win at mind games, we probably have to take a look at what we expect winning to look like and how we go about accomplishing it. Right? We're set up to expect big personalities. We see big personalities dominate their fields, and we assume that the way to get what we want in life, that the way to winning is to emulate their style, their flair, their big personality, their suck the air out of the room and demand the spotlight sort of persona. And yet what I've found is that the more we pursue and strive after the ways and words of Jesus, the more we find his ways at odds with this big, bold, in-your-face, grab power sort of way. If we read through the Gospels, and it doesn't take us long to see that Jesus, throughout his ministry, was continually seeking the position of a servant rather than a place in the spotlight. And yet somewhere along the way, we sometimes get that confused. And within the life of the first few generations of the church, that tension that exists between the way of celebrity and the way of Jesus, the way of power and the way of Jesus, created a tension much like it creates for us today. It's a tension that we find on display for us in the correspondence between the Apostle Paul and the churches in and around the city of Corinth. Corinth is a church that Paul had begun during his ministry travels. We read about it in the book of Acts. He was traveling all over the world as a missionary and a church planner. And the book of Acts tells us that Paul spent 18 months in the city of Corinth doing what he did everywhere he went, going into first the Jewish synagogues and then beyond the walls of the Jewish synagogue, announcing the good news that God raised Jesus from the dead. And as he did that, and people were drawn to the message of the good news of Jesus, he began churches, raised up leaders, and entrusted the work of the ministry to them. By the time we get to the New Testament, in Paul's era, the city of Corinth was the third most prominent city in the Roman Empire. It had a long, storied history, but its more recent history to the New Testament is what's particularly interesting, because we tend to think in terms of recent as a short-term amount of time, right? But realistically, when you take the scope of human history, like a couple hundred years is not that long, right? So the city of Corinth has this fascinating history leading into the New Testament era. In the year 146 BC, Rome came through as they're kind of conquering the world and decimated the city. Leveled it. And about 100 years later, the city was reborn under the reign of Julius Caesar. So the Corinth that Paul spent time in was not that old of a city at that point. It was, however, a prominent one. The population of the city proper was estimated to be around 80,000 people, with another 20,000 people in the outlying areas around Corinth. So this is a significant population basis, a significant place where Paul is spending time and launching the church. Now, one thing we know about the world of the New Testament is it was largely a class-based system. And so most people could never really get out of the class that they were born into. If you were born into a low social class, that's just kind of where you probably spent the entirety of your life. Upward mobility was not all that common of a thing. But because Corinth was kind of a newer city still, it didn't have that lineage and that long established hierarchy, which made it a prime place for social climbers. It was the kind of place people went when they were larger-than-life personalities, when they could walk into a room and know they were the biggest personality in the room, because Corinth was the kind of place that those people could break out of their social class. They could step into this world and create something new themselves. And so Corinth was the kind of place that was attractive to merchants and entrepreneurs and people who wanted to find ways to climb that social ladder. It was a newer city. It was in a strategic trade location. Corinth quickly began to draw a diverse population of people from all over the empire because there was jobs there. There was economic opportunity there. Sound familiar to anybody? Like, rapidly growing place, lots of people coming because there's jobs, there's business, there's stuff to do. The more the world changes, the more it stays the same. And so Paul steps into a place in Corinth where the climate of the culture is fueled by people who want to aggressively climb the social ladder. They're looking for upward mobility. They're looking to make something more of themselves. It's the kind of place that attracts the larger-than-life personalities who are used to being able to command the room. People who are looking to make a name for themselves. So we have two letters from the Apostle Paul to the church at Corinth. And those two letters refer to at least two more letters. So it seems that Paul had an ongoing exchange with the churches in and around Corinth. He was constantly involved. He had a long relationship with them. After all, he'd spent a year and a half establishing the church. I'm sure in that time he got to know many of the people within the church at Corinth quite well. And so he had what appears to be a seemingly deep investment in this church and a continual sort of communication with them. But if you're familiar at all with the letters that we call 1st and 2nd Corinthians, you might remember that Paul's relationship to the church at Corinth was at times a bit troubled as well. Right? There was some issues within the church at Corinth. It was a congregation that was often rife with division, which if we zoom out and assume that we're right in the social context of Corinthians, and you have a lot of upward mobile people who are used to getting their way and being able to force what they want to happen, and you put them all in a community and say, now exist for the good of each other, it might be a recipe for some division, some conflict, some confrontation, right? We also see in the letters between Paul and the church at Corinth that they had a tendency to turn a blind eye towards some immorality and some issues of sin that took root within the congregation. And so Paul's relationship to the church at Corinth is a complicated one, as best we can tell through the letters that we have, that he wrote them. The way that we try to reconstruct their end of the phone call and the answers that he's giving them in these letters. By the time we get to 2 Corinthians, there are some in the church who are a bit troubled by Paul and his personality. It seems that they think he's forceful in his correspondence. And at times, because of the division, because of the immorality that was being ignored within the church of Corinth, Paul had to be a bit forceful in his communication with the churches in and around Corinth. And so over time, some people had come into the church. It seems likely, we don't know for sure, but it seems likely at least that they may be newer to the church at Corinth. They may not have a personal connection with Paul from his missionary travels. And they begin to question whether Paul really has the right to tell them the way they should do things. What authority does he have? Is this guy even really an apostle? Because if I've got the story right, he was trying to kill Christians, not advance the good news of Jesus. And in time, this group that began to oppose Paul started to get some sway within the congregation at Corinth, and so it becomes an issue in the relationship between the Apostle Paul and the church at Corinth. So much so that it becomes an issue at the heart of this letter we know as 2 Corinthians. And this tension around Paul's authority, his right to speak into the life of the church, takes center stage as he moves to the later part of that letter. So I invite you to turn with me this morning to 2 Corinthians chapter 10. If you have a Bible with you, click on a device, open it up. Have it on the screen for you. If you're following along in YouVersion, just click on the Events tab. Everything on the screen will be there for you. 2 Corinthians chapter 10 is where we want to spend a few moments together today. Beginning in verse number 1, we read this. By the gentleness and humility of Christ, I appeal to you. I, Paul, who am timid when face to face with you, but bold when away. I beg that when I come to you, I may not have to be as bold as I expect to be towards some people who think we live by the standards of this world. For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ, and we will be ready to punish every act of disobedience once your obedience is complete. So we're heading into a portion of the letter here where Paul is going to address his critics head on. He's going to engage the concerns that they have about his authority, about his right to speak into the life of the church at Corinth, and he's not going to ignore the issues. And it seems their criticism of Paul is that he's big and bold in writing. When he's at a distance and he's sending them letters, he's shaking his fist at the heavens, he's telling them all the things they're doing wrong. But then when he shows up in person, he's quiet and he's timid, and he's soft-spoken and unimpressive. It's almost like the Corinthians are kind of accusing Paul of being like the world's first keyboard warrior, right? Like while he's like pounding away at the keyboard, he's like saying all kinds of stuff, and then you meet him and he's like, "That's okay, you know." And they're like, "Wait, this is the guy that sent us those letters?" Paul, it's not going to work that way, brother. Their assumption is he's bold in his letters, meek in person. They expect a rock star. They expect somebody who's going to walk in the room, suck the air out of it, and automatically be the biggest personality in the room. They expect Paul to be like one of them. One of these social climbers who had found their way to Corinth, who were doing everything they could to make their way and make a name for themselves. They expected him to be full of bluster and braggadocio, larger than life. They'd read his letters. They'd heard the stories. But then he showed up, and he was anything but that. So maybe this guy Paul isn't all he's cracked up to be. Maybe this guy Paul isn't the one that we should be listening to. Maybe he doesn't really have the right to speak into the life of the church at Corinth. In other words, why should we listen to him? This guy? Seriously? And what's his response? How does Paul respond here? By the gentleness and humility of Christ, I appeal to you. Right out of the gate, as Paul begins to address his critics, as he begins to take on their concerns about how he carries himself, how he presents his authority, he points them to the character of Jesus and how Jesus' character was the exact opposite of what they want Paul to be. So I'm big and bold and scary in my letters. But let me beseech you with humility and gentleness like Jesus. See, for Paul, the good news is not inseparable from the ways and words of Jesus. Paul believed he needed to embody the message of Jesus in the way of Jesus. And when he finds himself in conflict with these folks who want him to be big and bold and loud, I can't help but imagine it's kind of like when you make the call to customer service and you are mad and you want somebody to know it, and the person on the other end of the line is just so kind and so helpful and so gentle, and it just makes you madder because you want them to yell at you. You want them to push back. Don't look at me like I'm the only one that's ever mad and you want other people to be mad because you're mad. And I was like, yeah, you have a good day too. Right? What'd your mama say? Kill him with kindness, right? Paul's like, let me beseech you with the gentleness and humbleness of Christ to let you know, no, I'm not going to get sucked into that. I'm not going to get pulled in to this back and forth. He says, I hope I don't have to be as bold in person as I think I might have to be, because some of y'all don't know what it is to follow Jesus. That's not King James, but that's basically what he says here. Like, if you need me to be bold when I show up, I can be and I will be, because some of you seem to think that we conduct ourselves by the way of the world, and that's not going to cut it. That's Paul. It's by the gentleness and humility of Christ, I appeal to you. And then Paul here goes on. He's going to lay out some ideas that are key for us if we have any hope, any intent of winning at mind games. He says, even though we live in the world, we do not conduct ourselves by the standards of this world. What are those standards? Given what we know about the situation here in Corinth, given the conversation we've just been having about what the nature of the disagreement is, the disconnect between Paul and his opponents, what are those standards of the world most likely? Immediately our mind goes to morality stuff. We go, yep, we don't do that. But it seems like that's not really on what's on Paul's radar here. It seems much more that Paul is talking to these people who are living by a standard of the world that says bigger is better. That says might makes right. That says you win at all cost. It says it doesn't matter if what you say is true so long as you say it loud enough and often enough that people start to believe it. Paul says, we live in the world, but we don't conduct ourselves by the standard of the world. Paul says, no, because the weapons we fight with are not the same as the weapons of those outside of Christ. And Paul says it's counterintuitive. It's not what we would expect. But the weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world, and as counterintuitive as it seems, the weapons we choose, gentleness and humility of Christ with which he beseeches them, have the divine power, Paul says, to tear down strongholds, to dismantle arguments, and to make real and lasting change. And we go, yeah, but the ways and words of Jesus seem so counterintuitive. Yeah. They are. They are as counterintuitive as the notion that Jesus defeats sin and death by submitting to death and taking on the sin of the world. That's counterintuitive. That is backwards and upside down. That's not how we would do it, which is exactly the point. Though we live in the world, we do not practice the standards of this world. Those are not our weapons. And so we have to get our head around this idea that we can't count on brute force to do for us what only the force of Christ-like love can do for us. And we don't like that because we're inundated all of the time by a culture and a world that says might makes right, bigger is better. Doesn't matter if it's true, just say it louder, just say it longer. Somebody's in your way, step over them. Paul says, no. As counterintuitive as it seems, there are some things that cannot come by force. And so he says, since we reject the rules by which the world wants to fight, we've got to go about things differently. And how does he say we do that? He says, so because we have to go about things differently, take captive every thought. Take captive every intent. Take captive every tendency. Take captive every temptation to respond by the standards of this world and make those thoughts obedient to Christ. Make no mistake about this. Every single day, in 1,000 different ways, big and small, you and I are confronted with opportunities to live by the standard of this world. We are confronted with opportunities to submit to the way of thinking that says, if you hit me, I hit you back. If you wrong me, I'm justified in hurting you. We're inundated all the time with opportunities to say that if I want to be great, I have to step over anyone who's in my way, no matter the cost. What does Scripture say here? We don't fight that way. The weapons we choose are not those of the world, and yet they have power, divine power, to tear down strongholds, to dismantle arguments, to make lasting change. And Paul says, if you want to see that become reality, take those thoughts captive and make them obedient to Christ. I would put it like this for us, if you're following along in the notes and want to fill in some blanks. If we want to win at mind games, we need to figure out what it means to go on the offensive against anything offensive in you. Go on the offensive against anything that is offensive in you. Because there seems to be this sentiment today just like there was in Corinth, that assumes Christ-likeness is not sufficient to change the world. But I wonder at times if, as the people of God, it's less that we don't believe that the way of Jesus has the ability and the power and the authority to change the world, or if we're just afraid of what it will cost us. Because the way of Jesus is a way of sacrifice. The way of Jesus is the way of suffering. And to say that's the way we change the world seems really counterintuitive. As counterintuitive as the cross of Jesus. And Paul here, in this exchange with the church at Corinth, he recognizes that there is a draw in us to substitute power and braggadocio for gentleness and humility of Christ. He recognizes that. The easiest, the most natural, the most human response Paul could have to the people who say, oh yeah, you talk a big game when you're far away, but then you show up and you're like, okay boys, let's talk about what it means to follow Jesus. The most natural response, the most human response he could have is, you want me to show you what it means to be big and bold for Jesus? Come on, let's do it. Paul says, by the gentleness and humility of Christ, I appeal to you. I'm not going to play the game on those terms because we live in the world, but we do not conduct ourselves by its standards. So he recognizes this draw in us, and he rejects it outright. Though we are in the world, we do not conform to the standards of this world. Our weapons are different. The fight we fight is different. And so, take every thought captive, every impulse that goes counter to the ways and words of Jesus. Everything in you that is not of Christ, take captive and make it obedient to Jesus. Go on the offensive against anything offensive in you. When there is a way in you that is not the way of Jesus, reject it. Take it captive. And with the help of God's Holy Spirit, surrender yourself to be transformed. We sometimes think how we feel powerless in these mind games. We feel inundated with all of these messages, with all of these examples of what it is to live by the standard of the world, to pursue power by the standard of the world. And we say, what can we do? How can we fight that tide? I've finally reached a point. I have enough. It's time to push back. And Paul says, no. Those are the thoughts you need to take captive. Surrender them to Christ. Go on the offensive against anything offensive in you. Because human nature hasn't changed. We started last week by saying we have a problem. The problem's people, and I'm a people. Yeah, like the people problem is the same as it's always been. We are broken. We are bent to sin. The best intents God had for this world and for us has been marred by human rebellion. human nature hasn't changed. And there is as much a draw in us within our culture to say, if we're going to fight, here are the rules. Might makes right. Bigger is better. If you hit, I'm going to hit back harder. We see it. Last 24 hours, we've seen it play out on a global scale. And I'm in it now, we're going to get dirty. Here's the temptation, church. To take everything else that shapes our worldview, to pick a side and assume, now I'm in my corner. This is what it means to follow Jesus. Even if it leaves a bloody trail of slaughtered innocents. And Paul says there is a way of the world that says we solve violence and oppression with more violence and oppression. But we don't fight that way. That's not the way of the cross. You say, well, that makes for really bad geopolitics. You're right, it does. Because the kingdom of Jesus is not a kingdom of this world. It's backwards, it's upside down. And if we want to win at mind games, when this tendency to buy into the standard of the world rises up in us, grab those thoughts and take them captive. If you want to win at mind games, and you find yourself tempted to compromise your character just a little bit, because who will ever know? Who's it ever going to hurt? It's for the greater good, after all. Grab those thoughts and take them captive. If we want to win at mind games, when temptation comes and we decide, I want to see how close to sin I can get without crossing the line. When temptation seems to say, everything I want is within my reach. If I just give a little, grab those thoughts, take them captive, and make them obedient to Christ. If you want to win at mind games, when the opportunity comes to seemingly accomplish good for the kingdom of God using the standards of this world, grab those thoughts, take them captive. By the gentleness and humility of Christ, I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, go on the offensive against anything offensive in you. I should have stand with me as we pray. Invite the band to come back.